Hey guys! So, today we're gonna try to keep calm. We're going to try to focus on this video that I'm making because I just received a crisis warning from my company. So fires are burning absolutely everywhere. So I'll have to deal with that once we're done with this little video of mine. But let's get into it. So, today we are going to ask a fundamental question that I think that you should ask yourself before you make assumptions. We're going to talk about the size of the data. So let's get into it. Now, what do I mean about asking the fundamental question, what's the size of the data? Well, you see, in order for this to make any type of any sense at all, we're going to have to give you a slight bit of context. And the context that we need to give you is it wasn't all that long ago when I was working on a feature. It was a pretty nice feature. It's basically a feature for one of the administration panels that we support at my company. And so we had this discussion back, basically like the idea was that we were going to create a list of our users and products and so forth, and just have an interface basically where we could manage the different users. And so when we went through the code, we kind of had a discussion about how we would approach this problem. And so one of my coworkers started working on this and implemented a simple list function. We have an endpoint on the server, we go to said server, and we grab the data from the database, and then we present it on a page. Now I know what you're thinking, and I thought that as well. What happens when you list all of your users on a page? For the juniors out there, you may not know this because perhaps you haven't had this issue before, but usually you have quite a few users, depending on the size of the company, of course. I mean, if you are at an international company with millions and millions of users, you can imagine how it's not a great idea to grab all the users and list them on one page. That's where things such as what we call pagination comes into play, where pagination basically represents that you grab a certain amount of users on one page, and then you can query for the next page and so forth and so forth. And so we got into this great discussion about whether or not it makes sense to list all of the users. And we concluded something that I think it's a useful thought, because adding pagination and adding all of these extra layers of logic on top of things in order to kind of segment out a data set, or if you have a in-memory model of some sort with, say, you have a user and that user has a bunch of followers, that's also the same type of deal. Do you embed all of that into the same model? Or do you separate it through a join in a relational database, for example? Or, how do you want to deal with that? And the discussion kind of ended on us saying that when it comes to having a fairly small data set, the impact isn't all that big. When it comes to having a really big data set, the game changes completely. Now you're going to ask me, what do you mean? Like, that means that you have to make a case-by-case way off, correct? And you are correct. That's exactly what you have to do. Because if you try to list all of your users on one page and you have millions of users, that's a really bad idea. But on the other hand, you don't want to go to the other extreme and think that you have to optimize because you can do it wrong in the other direction. And what I mean by doing it wrong in the other direction is, say that you have a forum, a user has a certain amount of posts on a forum. Is that something that you should paginate and optimize for if you want to list them on a page? I will make the argument that maybe, but most likely not. If you consider it, because how many posts can one single user do? Let's go high, maybe a few hundred. maybe 1,000 posts, during the course of that user's lifetime within your system? Does it really make sense to try to optimize that and try to make fancy database queries, etc., or paginate that sort of information? Does it, like, you could make an argument for it. I'm not saying you shouldn't consider it, but do you really need to? So the thought I want to leave you with is that you have to consider the size, like the size of the data itself. It doesn't make sense to segment up a really small data set. And when I'm talking small, we have to define that. I'll give you a great example. Document databases, for example. People who are not so used to working with something like MongoDB, for example, they feel they're bothered that there's not a join statement or something of that nature, where it's very unintuitive to them to do what we like to call dump everything into the document. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that if you have a user that has a certain amount of posts on a forum, in a traditional relational situation, in a relational database, you might want to segment out the post into one table, join that information onto the user model and return the user. But in a document database, depending on how you think about it, it actually makes more sense to just dump all of it into just one array and bring it all back, instead of having one document that represents, or one collection rather, that represents the posts that the user has made. It's actually simpler from the model's perspective to simply have an array that holds all that information together with the user model itself. But as I said, in order for that to be a feasible solution, or something that actually like a good solution, you have to consider the size. Because remember, what if you have, like, for a single user, that might be okay, because this information that you're sending over the network to your web page is a single user with all the posts of that user in that payload. But what happens if you have a view where you're not listing just one user? Maybe you're listing the top 1,000 users. If you're sending 1,000 users times the amount of posts that they've made, now you're getting up into a little bit of size. It may still not be enough for you to see a performance hit on your page, but you're in the realm of having an issue. So these are the sort of considerations that you have to have when you do database queries and you're representing the information. And this is why I tell people that everything starts with the model. Your data model dictates quite a lot as to how your application can be used. And it's very tricky to foresee what type of issues you can have with your models. And this is usually why, at least in my experience, you find that it's almost impossible to foresee everything ahead of time. Because at the end of the day, when you're making a technical decision, it might be right for that one scenario, as I said in the scenario of my admin panel, showing a single user with all the posts without having pagination support and all of that good stuff. That makes sense. For that use case, it's a very nice solution. But in the other scenario, if we list all the users and all their posts, it's a horrible scenario. So you have to kind of weigh these things against each other. That's at least what I've found. So to summarize, when you're thinking about optimizing things, if you are trying to squeeze performance out of your system, don't try to optimize a really small data set, because it doesn't really matter all that much. It becomes important when you have a really large data set. But remember, even if one model has a small data set, what happens if you combine that model into a list of similar models? Does the problem grow? Think about that when you're putting together your database queries. Have a great day.